The sun beat down mercilessly on the Mongolian desert. Inside a rough wooden box, barely long enough to lie in, a woman was dying. This wasn't a hidden crime. It was a spectacle. Bowls of water sat tantalizingly close, yet cruelly out of reach, never refilled. Her pleas for a single drop, for a scrap of food, met only the silent indifference of the desert and the watchful eyes of her captors. Her voice had grown weak from days of begging, but still she tried, reaching through the narrow gaps in her wooden prison towards salvation that would never come. And documenting this agony, photographers, Albert Kahn and Stéphane Passé, they captured her image, her despair, frozen in time for the world to see. But the law, they said, tied their hands. They could only watch as a human being slowly faded away before their lenses, helpless to intervene in what authorities called justice. This single, documented horror in early 20th century Mongolia was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of centuries of a brutal practice known as coffin torture, a punishment designed for maximum suffering, a public warning etched in human agony. But this story, this nightmare, doesn't start in that desert. Her name is lost to history, but her suffering was meticulously documented. How did humanity reach a point where this scene was not only possible, but officially sanctioned? To understand this horror, we need to go back through centuries of calculated cruelty and systematic dehumanization. Imagine a world where a misplaced word, a scribbled protest, could condemn you to a public, agonizing death. This was the terrifying reality that birthed coffin torture. Medieval Europe lived under the crushing weight of absolute authority. Kings ruled by divine right, church leaders spoke with God's voice, and questioning either was more than rebellion, it was an attack on the very foundations of reality itself. The slightest dissent threatened to unravel the careful fiction that kept the powerful in control. Picture this: a peasant, exhausted by taxes and endless toil, scratches, "Down with the king," into a tavern wall. 3 simple words. In our world, perhaps a minor act of vandalism. In theirs, it was treason punishable by the most horrific death imaginable. The authorities didn't just want to punish the crime, they needed to terrify anyone who might even think about committing it. But the craziest part? Sometimes the words didn't even have to be treasonous. Religious authorities were equally paranoid about blasphemy. A drunk man shouting, "Satan is my savior," in a moment of despair could find himself facing the same fate as a political rebel. The system made no distinction between genuine threats and momentary lapses in judgment. The medieval mind saw words as having almost supernatural power. A curse could damn a soul, a blessing could save it, and the wrong words spoken at the wrong time could literally bring down kingdoms. This wasn't just superstition, it was a carefully constructed worldview that justified absolute control over human expression. Here's where it gets truly chilling. The authorities understood psychology better than we might expect. They knew that fear was their most powerful weapon, but it had to be the right kind of fear. Quick executions were forgotten too easily. Public hangings became routine spectacles that people grew numb to, but prolonged, visible suffering, that burned itself into memory, haunted dreams, and whispered warnings to anyone who might step out of line. So they created something designed not just to kill, but to psychologically destroy both victim and witness. Coffin torture served multiple masters. It eliminated dissidents, terrorized potential rebels, and demonstrated the absolute power of authority to reduce human beings to objects of public entertainment. The process began with the authorities identifying threats to their power. These weren't necessarily violent criminals or dangerous revolutionaries. Often, they were simply people who had spoken unwisely, written the wrong thing, or been in the wrong place when scapegoats were needed. The crime mattered less than the example that needed to be made. But here's what made this system particularly insidious. Prady. It created a climate where everyone became complicit in the machinery of oppression. Neighbors reported suspicious conversations. Tavern keepers memorized every careless word spoken in their establishments. Children learned to watch their parents' expressions for signs of dangerous thoughts. The psychological impact rippled through entire communities. People stopped talking about politics, stopped questioning religious doctrine, stopped expressing any opinion that might be construed as dissent. The very possibility of coffin torture transformed vibrant societies into collections of frightened individuals, each walking carefully through a world where the wrong word could mean a death too horrible to contemplate. The authorities celebrated this outcome. A population too terrified to speak was a population too terrified to rebel. Critics called it tyranny, rulers called it order. The distinction mattered little to those facing the wooden box or iron cage that awaited anyone who forgot their place in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. Yet, even as this system of terror took hold, human nature refused to be completely suppressed. There would always be someone desperate enough, angry enough, or brave enough to speak out. And when they did, the authorities had perfected the tools to make them regret it, slowly, publicly, and with maximum educational value for anyone watching. The irony was devastating. Societies that proclaimed to value human souls above all else had created punishments that systematically destroyed everything that made their victims human. Dignity, hope, physical integrity, sanity, all were considered acceptable casualties in the war against dissent. This wasn't the result of sadistic individuals operating in isolation. This was institutional cruelty, carefully planned and methodically executed by entire systems of government and religious authority. Scribes recorded the sentences, craftsmen built the instruments, guards maintained the prisons, crowds gathered to witness the results. The terrifying truth was that ordinary people, when embedded in the right social structures, could participate in horrors that would have been unthinkable as individual acts. And the methods they devised to enforce this control were as ingenious as they were barbaric. It wasn't just a cage. Sometimes it was a suit, an iron suit, shaped to a human body, designed not just to hold, but to crush. European craftsmen approached torture with the same meticulous attention to detail they brought to cathedral architecture or illuminated manuscripts. The tools of suffering weren't crude instruments thrown together in moments of rage. They were carefully engineered devices that represented what one historian grimly called artisanal cruelty. The basic coffin cage started simple enough, a rectangular box of iron bars or wooden slats, roughly human, sized but deliberately uncomfortable. The victim couldn't stand upright, couldn't lie down properly, couldn't find any position that didn't cause pain. Every angle pressed against bone, every movement brought fresh agony. But this was just the beginning of their ordeal. The real innovation came with what authorities euphemistically called cage suits, form-fitting iron constructions that wrapped around the human body like a second skin. Picture a medieval suit of armor, but designed for torture rather than protection. These devices didn't just confine the victim, they created what one contemporary account described as an iron hug that grew tighter as the body tried to find comfort. The psychological impact was as calculated as the physical design. Being locked inside a cage suit meant abandoning all hope of movement, all possibility of relief. The victim became a living statue, conscious and suffering but unable to respond to their body's desperate need for repositioning, stretching, or simple human comfort. But here's where the true genius of European cruelty revealed itself. These weren't just instruments of confinement. They were designed to transform human beings into public spectacles. The cages would be suspended from gibbets or hung from tree branches, turning the victim into a grotesque ornament that the entire community was forced to witness. The height served multiple purposes. It made the victim visible from great distances, ensuring maximum educational impact for anyone passing by. It also placed them beyond the reach of any sympathetic soul who might try to offer comfort or mercy. Most importantly, it transformed the victim into something less than human, a warning sign, a piece of public furniture, an object rather than a person. The construction details reveal the methodical nature of this cruelty. Iron rings were carefully positioned to allow for secure mounting, while ensuring the victim remained upright enough to be clearly visible. Spacing between bars was calculated to prevent escape, while allowing observers to see the suffering face within. Even the materials were chosen for maximum psychological impact. Iron suggested permanence. Wood implied the temporary nature of human life. Local blacksmiths and carpenters often received these commissions as routine work orders. They would craft instruments of torture with the same professional pride they brought to horseshoes or furniture, discussing technical specifications and improvement possibilities with the casual detachment of any craftsman perfecting their trade. The installation process became part of the spectacle itself. Crowds would gather to watch the condemned being locked into their cage, hoisted into position, and left to begin their slow transformation from person to public warning. The mechanical precision of the process, the clanking of chains, the creaking of ropes, the final metallic slam of the cage door, created an auditory signature that would haunt the memories of everyone present. Some cages included refinements that revealed the twisted creativity of their designers. Adjustable sections allowed authorities to customize the fit, ensuring maximum discomfort for victims of different sizes. Internal spikes, or rough surfaces, created additional sources of pain without causing immediately fatal injuries. Drainage holes prevented the accumulation of rainwater that might provide unwanted relief. The maintenance of these devices required ongoing community participation. Someone had to oil the hinges, repair weather damage, and ensure the mechanisms remained functional for future use. This routine upkeep normalized the presence of torture equipment in daily life, making instruments of horror as commonplace as church bells or market stalls. Weather became another instrument of torture. Summer sun turned metal cages into ovens, while winter frost made them freezing chambers that slowly sapped the victim's remaining strength. Rain provided momentary relief from thirst but soaked through clothing, creating additional misery when temperatures drop. The positioning of cages followed careful psychological calculations. They were placed where maximum numbers of people would see them, near market squares, along main roads, outside church entrances. The message was inescapable. This is what happens to those who challenge authority. But the physical torment of the cage itself was often just the beginning of their ordeal. The executioner wasn't always the only one inflicting pain. Sometimes, it was the entire town. The moment the cage door slammed shut, the victim's ordeal transformed from private suffering into public entertainment. Medieval communities didn't just tolerate these spectacles, they actively participated in them, turning torture into a collective ritual that revealed the darkest aspects of human nature when given official sanction to express cruelty. Townspeople would gather around the suspended cages like audiences at a theatre, but this performance had no script and no predetermined ending. The victims' agony became the day's entertainment, their desperate pleas for mercy, the soundtrack to ordinary life continuing around them. Markets operated in the shadow of torture, children played within sight of slow death, and daily routines adapted to incorporate the presence of systematic suffering. The authorities often encouraged this public participation, understanding that widespread complicity in cruelty created stronger social bonds among the righteous, while further isolating the condemned. Crowds were sometimes explicitly permitted to throw rocks and stones at the caged victims, turning communal violence into a form of civic duty. But get this, the crowd participation wasn't random mob violence. It was carefully orchestrated theatre designed to maximize both the victim's suffering and the community's investment in the punishment. Children were encouraged to practice their aim, turning target practice on human beings into a twisted form of education about social order and divine justice. When authorities decided that direct violence might shorten the victim's suffering too much, they implemented more subtle forms of crowd-based torture. The condemned would be stripped of clothing and left exposed to the elements, transforming weather itself into an instrument of communal punishment. European winters became weapons, summer heat became torture, and every change in temperature brought fresh agony witnessed by the entire community. The exposure served multiple purposes beyond simple physical discomfort. It stripped away the last vestiges of human dignity, reducing the victim to an object of shame and ridicule. Naked bodies in cages became symbols of complete social rejection, living examples of what happened to those who forgot their place in the cosmic order. The real horror lay in how quickly communities adapted to these spectacles. What initially shocked and disturbed townspeople became routine background noise. Vendors learned to position their stalls for optimal views of the suffering. Children incorporated the caged victims into their games. Adults planned their daily routes to pass by the torture sites, checking on the progress of the slow dying like farmers monitoring crops. The psychological impact on observers was profound and deliberately cultivated. Witnesses were forced to confront their own vulnerability while simultaneously participating in the dehumanization of the victims. This created a twisted form of social solidarity. Everyone who watched, threw stones, or simply walked by became complicit in the system that could just as easily target them next. Dehydration became the community's weapon of choice. The human body can survive only about 3 days without water, creating a precise ticking clock that allowed crowds to bet on exact death times. This morbid gambling transformed individual suffering into collective entertainment, with the victims approaching death serving as the climax to a community-wide performance. The sound of the dying became part of the town's daily rhythm: weak cries for water, desperate pleas for mercy, and eventually the silence that meant another example had been made. These audio markers punctuated ordinary life, reminding everyone of the consequences of stepping outside accepted boundaries while slowly deadening community empathy through constant exposure to suffering. Local clergy often blessed these proceedings, framing the torture as divine justice and the victim's agony as necessary spiritual purification. This religious sanction transformed sadistic entertainment into holy ritual, giving community participation the blessing of both earthly and heavenly authority. Even death didn't end the spectacle. Corpses would be left in their cages for weeks or months, providing ongoing education about the consequences of dissent while demonstrating the authorities' power over life, death, and everything beyond. Bodies became teaching tools, their slow decay a visual timeline of what happened to those who challenged the established order. The scavenging animals that eventually came for the remains became part of the show. Birds picking at exposed flesh, rats gnawing on bones, insects claiming their portion, all of this natural recycling happened in full view of the community, completing the transformation of human beings into object lessons about power and submission. The psychological scarring of witnesses, especially children, was considered an acceptable cost for maintaining social order. Communities that could watch neighbors die slowly without intervening were communities that would never seriously challenge authority. And even death itself didn't always bring an end to the horrifying display. By the 18th century, a subtle shift occurred. The screams sometimes faded, replaced by a more silent, yet equally potent, form of terror. The evolution of coffin torture reflected changing social sensibilities and advancing theories about effective deterrence. While earlier centuries had favored maximum live suffering, later periods discovered that the strategic display of the dead could be equally effective at controlling the living, with the added benefit of avoiding the daily maintenance required by live victims. John Whitfield's case perfectly illustrates this transition period. The highwayman had terrorized English roads for years before his capture in 1768. But instead of a quick hanging, authorities decided to make an example that would resonate through the criminal underworld for generations. Whitfield was chained and hung alive in a gibbet cage, left to die slowly while travelers passed beneath him on the very roads he had once haunted. The irony was deliberate and cruel. The man who had made these paths dangerous for honest travelers would spend his final days watching those same roads from a position of absolute helplessness. Every merchant, every coach, every ordinary citizen who passed below served as a reminder of the life he could no longer threaten and the society that had ultimately claimed dominion over him. William Kidd's fate revealed how authorities adapted these practices for maximum symbolic impact. The notorious pirate captain was first hanged in the traditional manner, but death was just the beginning of his public humiliation. Kidd's corpse was placed in a specially constructed gibbet cage and displayed along the Thames, where every ship entering or leaving London would pass his remains. The maritime location wasn't accidental. Kidd's decomposing body became a warning specifically targeted at sailors and potential pirates, a rotting testament to the Crown's reach, extending far beyond English shores. For months, his remains served as both tourist attraction and deterrent, drawing curious crowds while warning seafarers about the consequences of choosing piracy over legitimate trade. But here's where the practice reveals its most disturbing aspect. These displays became actual tourist destinations. Londoners would plan outings to view famous criminals' remains, bringing families to see the decomposing bodies of people who had once been household names. The transformation of human remains into entertainment speaks to how thoroughly the authorities had succeeded in dehumanizing their victims. Local communities often complained about these installations, but their objections focused on practical concerns rather than moral ones. The stench became overwhelming during warm weather, the sight disturbed property values, and the constant presence of corpses created health concerns. But the political effectiveness of the displays usually overruled these complaints, until decomposition had completed its educational purpose. The practice spread across the British Empire, adapting to local conditions while maintaining its core purpose of terrorizing potential dissidents. In New York, Cuban pirates captured in 1815 found themselves displayed in gibbet cages as warnings to anyone considering similar careers. The message was universal: challenge established authority, and your body becomes public property even after death. The transition from live torture to post-mortem display reflected changing ideas about effective governance. Live victims required feeding, guarding, and constant maintenance. Dead bodies simply needed occasional repositioning and weather protection. The economic efficiency appealed to administrators, while the psychological impact remained devastating for communities forced to witness the slow dissolution of human remains. The legal framework supporting these practices revealed how thoroughly normalized state-sanctioned brutality had become. Courts issued specific instructions about display duration, location requirements, and maintenance responsibilities. Bureaucrats processed gibbet construction orders with the same routine attention they gave to road repairs or tax collection. The social impact extended far beyond the immediate spectacle. Children grew up in communities where human remains were permanent fixtures of the landscape. Adults planned their daily activities around the presence of decomposing bodies. Merchants advertised their proximity to famous gibbet sites, turning horror into economic opportunity. Yet even as these practices reached their peak of institutional acceptance, social attitudes were slowly shifting. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and human dignity began to challenge the assumption that public torture served legitimate governmental purposes. Reformers argued that such displays brutalized communities rather than protecting them, creating cycles of violence that undermined the very order they claimed to preserve. The decline of gibbeting coincided with evolving theories about crime, punishment, and social control. Authorities began to recognize that excessive brutality might actually undermine respect for law rather than reinforcing it. The spectacle of state-sanctioned torture was starting to look less like justice and more like barbarism. But while Europe debated the nuances of displaying the dead, a far more brutal reality of live entombment was thriving elsewhere, in the lightless heart of Mongolia. Forget the public square. In Mongolia, the true horror lay hidden, in pitch-black boxes, within a prison whose name alone whispered of unspeakable suffering, Urgger. While European authorities preferred their torture as public spectacle, Mongolian justice operated in shadow and silence. The notorious prison at Urgger represented a completely different philosophy of punishment, one that prioritized psychological destruction over public deterrence, creating suffering so complete and isolated that it existed beyond the reach of human witness or mercy. The journey to Urgger itself became part of the punishment. Prisoners would be transported across vast expanses of desert and steppe, chained and exposed to elements that could kill long before any formal execution. Those who survived the transport arrived already broken, their spirits crushed by the endless landscape that seemed to stretch beyond all possibility of rescue or escape. The prison's design revealed a systematic understanding of how to break human beings through environmental manipulation. A fenced wooden enclosure contained small, pitch-black houses that looked deceptively modest from the outside. But these structures were carefully engineered chambers of despair, designed to strip away every comfort that made life bearable. The buildings themselves were freezing monuments to calculated cruelty. Mongolian winters could kill in hours, and the thin wooden walls provided no protection against temperatures that regularly dropped far below survival thresholds. Prisoners faced a daily battle against death by exposure, their bodies slowly surrendering heat and hope in equal measure. Inside these houses, the real instruments of torture waited. Wooden boxes and coffins had been constructed with precise dimensions, calculated to maximize discomfort while preventing immediate death. The Mongolian approach differed from European methods in its complete rejection of any pretense about justice or mercy. This was pure, systematic destruction of human consciousness. The 15-foot-high sharp timber palisades surrounding the entire complex created a barrier that was both physical and psychological. The spikes weren't just defensive measures, they were visual reminders that escape was impossible, that the world beyond had been permanently severed from the reality inside. Every upward glance met those wooden teeth, a fence of despair that enclosed a universe of suffering. But here's what made Urgger particularly terrifying. It operated in complete secrecy. Unlike European public punishments, Mongolian torture happened in darkness and silence. No crowds gathered to witness the suffering. No community participated in the cruelty. The victims simply disappeared into those black houses, erased from the world as completely as if they had never existed. The isolation served multiple purposes. Without witnesses, authorities faced no pressure to moderate their methods or shorten sentences. Without community involvement, there was no risk of sympathy developing for the victims. Without public spectacle, the full extent of the horror remained hidden from potential critics or reformers. The guards who maintained this system developed their own psychological adaptations to the daily reality of systematic torture. They learned to view the prisoners as already dead, as problems to be managed rather than people to be pitied. This emotional distancing allowed ordinary individuals to participate in extraordinary cruelty without conscious guilt or visible moral conflict. The reputation of Urgger spread through whispered warnings across Central Asia. Nomadic peoples shared stories of those who had entered the black houses and never emerged. Traders carried tales of sounds that drifted from the compound on still nights, not screams, which would have been merciful, but worse sounds that suggested suffering beyond the reach of normal human expression. The bureaucracy of Urgger operated with methodical precision. Records were kept of prisoner arrivals, box assignments, and feeding schedules. Guards maintained logs of cleaning routines, structural repairs, and medical observations. The systematic nature of the documentation reveals how thoroughly normalized this extreme cruelty had become within the administrative structure. Local communities learned to avoid the area entirely. Merchants altered their trade routes to bypass the prison compound. Nomadic families steered their herds away from regions where the black houses stood. Even the landscape around Urgger became contaminated by association, transformed into a geographic warning about the consequences of challenging Mongolian authority. The seasonal nature of Mongolian weather created additional layers of torment. Spring brought floods that turned the compound into a muddy hell. Summer heat made the wooden boxes into ovens. Autumn winds carried the sounds of suffering across vast distances. Winter transformed the entire complex into a frozen monument to human endurance under impossible conditions. The psychological impact on society extended far beyond the prison walls. The mere knowledge that such a place existed, that disappearance into absolute suffering was always possible, created a climate of fear that permeated daily life across Mongolia. And inside those freezing houses, the boxes of death waited, each one a perfectly engineered instrument of slow agony. 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, 1.5 feet tall, dimensions not for living, but for the slow erasure of a human being. The Mongolian box of death represented the pinnacle of engineered human suffering. Every measurement had been calculated with scientific precision to create maximum agony while preventing immediate death. The victim couldn't sit upright without their head pressing against the lid. They couldn't lie flat without their legs cramping against the sides. They couldn't find any position that didn't create fresh sources of pain. The psychological impact of these dimensions was immediate and devastating. The moment the lid closed, victims experienced complete spatial disorientation. The darkness was absolute, the confinement total. Every natural human instinct, to stretch, to stand, to move freely, was instantly frustrated by wooden walls that became the entire universe. One small 6-inch hole provided the only connection to the outside world. This tiny opening served multiple functions: minimal light barely sufficient to distinguish day from night, a feeding slot for meager rations passed through irregularly, and the only means for removing human waste every 2 to 3 weeks. The indignity of this arrangement was carefully calculated to strip away the last vestiges of human dignity. The feeding schedule revealed the methodical cruelty behind the system. Prisoners received just enough sustenance to prevent immediate death, but never enough to maintain physical strength or mental clarity. The irregular timing meant victims never knew when relief might come, creating a psychological dependence that made survival contingent on their captors' whims. But here's where the true genius of Mongolian torture revealed itself: the extended duration. While European methods often killed within days or weeks, Mongolian coffins were designed for much longer sentences. Lesser offences might warrant weeks of confinement, but serious crimes could result in life sentences within these wooden tombs. The physical deterioration followed a predictable pattern that authorities had observed and documented over countless victims. First, the inability to exercise properly led to rapid muscle atrophy. Limbs began to shrink and waste away as the body consumed its own tissue for survival. Joint flexibility disappeared as positions became locked by the constraints of the box. The sensory deprivation created its own form of torture. With virtually no visual stimulation, prisoners lost their ability to process light and images. Many emerged permanently blinded. Their optical systems simply shut down from disuse. The constant darkness played tricks on perception, creating hallucinations that blurred the line between reality and madness. The loss of sanity was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Mongolian system. Unlike quick executions that preserved the victim's essential humanity until the moment of death, coffin torture systematically dismantled consciousness itself. Prisoners reported losing track of time, forgetting their own names, and eventually losing the ability to distinguish between sleep and wakefulness. For those deemed escape risks, additional restraints made the ordeal even more horrific. Heavy chains around the neck connected to manacles on the hands, creating a web of metal that further restricted movement within the already impossibly confining space. These prisoners lived in a state of perpetual bondage, unable to reach the tiny hole for feeding without fighting against restraints that cut into flesh with every movement. The ethnic and political dimensions of Mongolian coffin torture revealed systematic persecution disguised as criminal justice. Chinese prisoners, described in contemporary accounts as refined Chinese shut up for life, faced particular brutality. Their cultural differences were treated as evidence of inherent criminality, justifying extended sentences in conditions designed to destroy both body and mind. Many victims died before their sentences were completed, succumbing to the combined effects of freezing temperatures, malnutrition, disease, and psychological breakdown. These deaths were often recorded as natural causes, obscuring the reality that the prisoners had been slowly murdered by the conditions of their confinement. The few who survived extended periods in the boxes emerged as living warnings about the consequences of challenging Mongolian authority. Their wasted bodies, damaged minds, and haunted expressions served as more effective deterrents than any public execution could have achieved. The maintenance of this system required a bureaucracy of cruelty that extended far beyond the prison walls. Guards, administrators, record keepers, and suppliers all participated in maintaining the machinery of systematic torture. Each person's individual contribution might seem minor, but collectively they enabled a system that destroyed hundreds of lives through calculated suffering. The sounds that emerged from the boxes became a source of particular psychological torment for both victims and guards. The confined prisoners' voices changed over time, becoming less human and more like the sounds of trapped animals. These audio reminders of suffering created an atmosphere of constant dread that permeated the entire prison complex. Yet amidst this systematic cruelty, one woman's fate would be seared into history, not by a guard's hand, but by the lens of a camera. Sometimes, the most powerful indictment of cruelty isn't a proclamation or a rebellion, but a photograph, a single, silent image that screams the truth. In the early 20th century, photography had begun to penetrate even the most remote corners of the world, carrying with it the unprecedented power to document reality in ways that no written account could match. When Albert Kahn and Stefan Passé arrived in Mongolia with their cameras, they expected to capture exotic landscapes and cultural practices. They never anticipated becoming witnesses to a horror that would challenge everything they believed about human civilization. The woman they encountered had been condemned to one of the most extreme forms of coffin torture imaginable: slow starvation in a wooden box placed in a remote desert location. This wasn't the relative mercy of the Urgger prison boxes, where victims at least received minimal sustenance. This was deliberate, systematic murder, carried out in the open air under the blazing Mongolian sun. The photographer's first glimpse of the scene must have been shattering. Here was a human being, clearly dying, trapped in a wooden coffin barely large enough to contain her body. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, emphasizing the complete isolation of her predicament. No help could come from that vast emptiness. No rescue was possible from the civilization that had condemned her to this fate. But the detail that revealed the true calculated cruelty of her situation was the presence of water bowls, placed just outside her reach, These containers held the salvation she desperately needed, but could never obtain. The authorities had positioned them precisely to maximize psychological torture, close enough for her to see, to smell the moisture, to dream about relief that would never come. Her begging, captured in the photographer's accounts, reveals the systematic destruction of human dignity that coffin torture was designed to achieve. This wasn't just punishment for a crime, this was the deliberate reduction of a human being to an object of suffering, a living lesson about the consequences of challenging authority. The photographers faced an impossible ethical dilemma. As foreigners in Mongolia, they had no legal standing to intervene in what the authorities presented as legitimate criminal justice. Any attempt to provide food or water could result in their own imprisonment or worse. Yet their presence at the scene made them unwilling witnesses to what was essentially a public execution by slow torture. The decision to photograph the scene created another layer of moral complexity. The images would preserve evidence of the woman's suffering for future generations, potentially serving as testimony against such practices. But the act of documentation also transformed her agony into a kind of performance, her death into a historical artifact that could be viewed and analyzed by people who had never faced such desperate circumstances. The technical challenges of desert photography in that era meant that capturing these images required extended exposure times. The photographers had to remain at the scene for significant periods, listening to her pleas for help while setting up equipment and adjusting settings. The mechanical requirements of their craft forced them to spend precious time documenting suffering they were powerless to alleviate. The woman's awareness of being photographed added another dimension to her torment. She may have hoped that these foreign witnesses would somehow rescue her, that their cameras represented a chance for intervention or mercy. The gradual realization that they could only record, not save, must have been its own form of psychological torture. The legal constraints that prevented the photographers from helping revealed how thoroughly normalized such extreme punishments had become within Mongolian society. The authorities felt no shame about allowing foreigners to witness and document their methods. This wasn't hidden brutality. It was official policy that they were apparently proud to display to international observers. The desert setting transformed the execution into a cosmic drama of human versus environment. The woman's struggle wasn't just against her human captors, but against the sun, wind, and endless landscape that surrounded her wooden prison. The natural world itself became complicit in her destruction, offering no shelter, no water, no relief from the torment that human beings had designed for her. The photographs that resulted from this encounter would eventually reach audiences around the world, carrying with them an indictment of systematic cruelty that transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries. No translation was needed to understand the horror captured in those images, no explanation required to grasp the inhumanity they documented. The unrefilled water bowls became symbols of deliberate torture disguised as justice, proof that her suffering wasn't accidental but carefully orchestrated to maximize agony while maintaining the pretense of legal execution. And as they packed their cameras, the image of her face, the sound of her pleas, and the unrefilled bowls of water became an undeniable testament to a horror the world needed to see. The woman's voice had grown weaker since the photographers first arrived. The Mongolian sun, relentless and unforgiving, had continued its work alongside the wooden coffin that held her captive. Her pleas for water had become whispers, her desperate reaches toward the bowls transformed into barely perceptible movements of trembling fingers. Albert Kahn and Stéphane Passé completed their documentation with heavy hearts, knowing they were capturing the final chapter of a human story that should never have been written. The images they preserved would travel far beyond these desolate sands, carrying with them an indictment of cruelty that no civilized society could ignore once confronted with its reality. The woman's name was never recorded in any official document. Her crime, if it existed at all, remains unknown to history. But her suffering, frozen forever in those photographs, became an eternal witness to humanity's capacity for systematic torture disguised as justice. Her death came slowly, as designed. The Mongolian authorities had perfected their calculations of survival time without water or food in desert conditions. They knew exactly how long the process would take, how much suffering could be extracted from a single human life, how to time the spectacle for maximum educational impact on potential future dissidents. The practice of coffin torture, in all its various forms, would eventually be abolished in Mongolia during the 1920s, as modernizing influences and international pressure made such extreme punishments politically unsustainable. The wooden boxes of Urgger prison were dismantled, the desert execution sites abandoned, the systematic machinery of prolonged torture officially discontinued. But the abolition of legal coffin torture didn't erase the psychological scars it had left on Mongolian society. Generations had grown up knowing that such fates were possible, that human beings could disappear into wooden boxes and emerge months later as broken shadows of their former selves, if they emerged at all. The photographs taken by Khan and Passe became historical documents of immeasurable importance, preserving evidence of practices that authorities preferred to forget. These images served as proof that the horrors described in whispered accounts were not exaggerations or legends, but documented reality, witnessed by credible observers from the outside world. The broader pattern of coffin torture across cultures and centuries reveals disturbing truths about human nature and the corrupting influence of absolute power. From medieval European gibbets to Mongolian boxes of death, societies consistently developed similar methods of prolonged torture, despite having no direct contact with each other. The universality of these practices suggests something fundamental about how power structures seek to maintain control through fear. The bureaucratization of extreme cruelty stands as perhaps the most chilling aspect of coffin torture. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence or passionate crimes of revenge. They were carefully planned, methodically executed, and systematically maintained by entire institutions that had convinced themselves such suffering served legitimate purposes. The transformation of human beings into objects of public education reveals how societies can normalize the most extreme behaviors when they serve perceived political or social needs. The victims of coffin torture weren't seen as people deserving mercy or consideration. They were viewed as teaching tools, warning signs, and instruments of social control. The role of witnesses, whether medieval crowds throwing stones or Mongolian authorities maintaining prison records, demonstrates how individual moral responsibility becomes diffused within systems of institutional cruelty. Each person's participation seemed minor, but collectively they enabled horrors that no individual would have contemplated committing alone. Modern observers might comfort themselves with the belief that such extreme practices belong to humanity's distant past, but the psychological mechanisms that enabled coffin torture remain present in contemporary societies. The capacity for systematic dehumanization, the willingness to inflict suffering for perceived greater goods, the bureaucratization of cruelty, these patterns persist wherever power operates without effective moral constraints. The woman in the Mongolian desert represents more than a historical curiosity or an extreme example of past brutality. Her suffering embodies the eternal human struggle between dignity and oppression, between individual worth and systemic power. Her unnamed agony speaks for countless others whose stories were never documented, whose deaths left no photographic evidence, whose torture served purposes they never understood. The water bowls that remained forever out of her reach have become symbols of deliberate cruelty disguised as justice. They represent the calculated nature of institutional torture, the careful calibration of suffering designed to extract maximum educational value from individual human destruction. The abolition of coffin torture in the 1920s marked not just the end of a specific practice, but a recognition that certain forms of punishment are incompatible with any definition of civilized society. The international pressure that helped end these practices demonstrated how documentation and witness testimony could eventually overcome even entrenched systems of systematic cruelty. Yet the lesson of coffin torture extends beyond historical analysis into contemporary moral responsibility. The same psychological and institutional mechanisms that enabled centuries of systematic torture remain present in modern societies, waiting for the right combination of fear, power, and moral blindness to create new forms of organized suffering. The woman in the desert died alone, but her documented suffering ensures that her death serves a purpose she never could have imagined, as eternal testimony to the importance of preserving human dignity against any system that would reduce people to objects of trample, punishment, control, or education. Her story reminds us that the price of civilization is constant vigilance against our own capacity for systematic cruelty.